And welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. We're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions around their money, their careers, and their practices. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a no-commission fiduciary financial planning firm just for optometrists nationwide. And on today's episode, I have another fantastic guest, Dr. Chris Wolfe, owner of Exclusively Eye Care and also at iCode Media and iCode Education. And we talk about his experience navigating an internal succession plan in his practice. We talk about what he would look for in an associate that would potentially buy into a practice in the future. We talk about private equity and its impact on the optometry profession, both now and into the future. And then lastly, we talk about the future of optometry and the great opportunity for private practice in the midst of challenges and how specialties in a practice play a role in that. If you have any questions on today's episode or ideas about future topics for future shows, send over an email, Evon, E-V-O-N, at optometrywealth.com. All of the resources, links, information mentioned in today's episode will be in the show notes, which you can find at the Education Hub on my website, optometrywealth.com. And while you're there, feel free to schedule a no-commitment introductory call, and we can talk about whatever's on your mind financially, and you can learn more about how we help optometrists all over the country navigate decisions around taxes, student loans, cash flow, getting into practice ownership, and beyond. And if you've enjoyed this episode or other episodes here on the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your peers and leave a review. Your reviews, your feedback is super important to help me turn the show into a better and better resource for you in the optometry profession. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Chris Wolfe. And thank you so much for listening once again to the Optometry Money Podcast. I'm your host, Evon Mendrin, and I am here with another awesome guest, Dr. Chris Wolfe. Chris, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Evon. Appreciate it.
Well, I'm excited to talk with you about a few different things today. I want to get a feel for your background and how you got into practice ownership and what that transition was like through your experience. But I also want to talk about something that's a big popular topic right now in the optometry profession, which is private equity and how private equity is impacting the profession, private practices, and how you see that looking into the future. So before we sort of dive into those topics, I want to ask you about your background. What got you into optometry? Why did you get into the profession?
Yeah, I mean, the simple way to talk about it would be that my dad's an optometrist, but that wouldn't highlight the nuance of it. So I went, undergraduate. I actually took a year off after undergrad. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and through undergrad, I worked in the practice. I edged jobs. So in terms of like how long ago that was, we actually had a pattern edger, so I'd be in the lab and we'd have patterns for every single frame and I would edge those down. So I got a sense of what it was like. And then I took a year off and then I teched for my dad. So then I kind of really got a feel of what he did on a day in, day out basis. And it matched, what you and I have talked about before is a lifestyle. My parents we pretty much had everything we needed and most of what we wanted when we were growing up. Probably not most of what we wanted, but we had some of the things we wanted. And my parents had the flexibility to take trips with us, with themselves. And so it was just a lifestyle that felt normal to me, that felt good to me. I like to be able to help people. And this seemed like a meaningful way that I could do that. And so, fast forward, I got out of school in 2008 and the whole goal would be that I would join my dad in practice. And that's what I did. And so I practiced a few years and then we sort of had this transition period where, the goal ultimately was to transition that practice into my hands. But as we had discussed, it's not necessarily an easy ask to say, okay, we have this practice that's worth, a significant amount. Hey, doctor that has at the time, $110,000 of debt or $250,000 of debt plus now. Hey, I want you to buy into the practice 2 years out of school. It's very challenging to do. And one of the things that I think my parents were very visionary in doing was figuring out a way where they they probably didn't, well, for sure, they didn't get as much cash value out of the practice as they otherwise could have, but they figure out a way to kind of transition some of that value to me, where my dad's benefit was he still made, distribution as an owner, as a majority owner for a lot of years, and then also had less work, right? Our salaries were similar. He had, at some point there was a flip where I was producing more, but I was still getting less of the distributions. But the advantage is I had the ability to obtain ownership in that practice more gradually and more at a more reasonable price than had I had to come to the table all at once. And so, I was kind of taking it a little bit because I was working more and producing more than he was. But on the other hand, and he got more time, but he was taking it a little bit because he didn't get as much dollars out of the practice in terms of end game dollars, right? So that's how we made it work. And I can happily talk about specifics there, but I think that transition where there were times where it's like, man, I'm producing all this and he's working, I'm working all this time, but ultimately I knew he was doing it in my best. He was coming to the table in my best interest, as well as the practice's best interest and our patient's best interest. And I was doing the same thing. And so we never felt like the other person was really getting shortchanged. It never got to a head of like, gosh, I feel like I'm doing all this work, or he feels like, it just, maybe it worked because it was fortunate, but that's the way it worked for us to transition to the practice. And then, I told you before, 2021 rolls around and he decides he wants to retire by middle of 2022. And so I had enough ownership in the practice, enough equity in the practice, enough history in the practice to easily buy him out. And so that was our practice transition. It's a long practice transition. It is not a quick one. And it took trust on both of our sides for sure. Besides the legal documentations, all that other kind of stuff, it took a lot of trust,
right,
a lot of goodwill.
And how many years was it from when you first started gaining equity in the practice to when 2021 when you get full ownership?
Yeah, so it was 2 years. I was basically in practice for 2 years before I became a very, very, very minority partner.
Yeah.
And then essentially what I did was I bought as much as I could. I was gifted a little from a tax advantage standpoint. They got some tax advantage. I got some advantages from that as well, to get more equity without a huge outlay of cash. And then basically I took, extra money every year and spent more. So ultimately to get from 2010 to 2020 to get 50% of that practice. Now, during that time, the practice grew by about 100%. So from 2008 to 2021, essentially I was there about a 2-year period where we were basically 50-50 partners before I bought the rest of it out. So yeah, it was a 10-year period to get to 50%.
And how did you approach valuing the practice over all these different years? Because you're buying into it in chunks. Like you're saying, the practice value is growing along the way, and then you're purchasing the other half all in 1 year. Was there an agreed upon price at the very beginning? How did you look at valuing the practice over that whole transition?
Yeah, it was very simple. So when I came out of school, my dad, looked at different numbers, different valuations, and we valued it. And, I think it was something like 65 or 75% of the last year's gross. He looked at 3 different mechanisms of like EBITDA, and then years growth, not years growth, but years gross, and then 3 years, and essentially like all the numbers were about the same. So he said, this is what we're going to buy when you're going to buy in. This is what we're going to value the practice at, and it will always be valued at that. And I was prepared when I bought that second 50%. I was prepared to pay the additional on that growth, right? So I'm now buying 50% of that growth, but I didn't have to. He actually said the value is what it is. The reason the practice grew over the last 10 years was because of the sweat equity that you put into it.
Right.
And he got all that value on like going through, because there were probably 4 years of that period he was working 2 days a week, right? So 2 or 3 days a week. So all that growth was coming from work that I was doing, but he was guiding me through it. So again, like I said, he took less than he could have. Like I was prepared to say, okay, now we've doubled the practice. I'm going to have to pay that last 50% is going to come for that. Well, no, he didn't. It was basically what the original value was. So I got a huge value in the equity and the sweat equity that I put in the practice. And that's why what I mean is that he probably didn't get everything he thought he could get out of it. I didn't get, for the time, I didn't get distributions that were commensurate with the amount of time I was putting in, but it all worked out.
Yeah. Well, essentially your work as an employee to the practice was a part of why the value of that business was growing. And I feel like partnerships are always a bit of a tricky thing between two co-owners. I feel like it would be even more tricky when it's within the family, especially when it's father and son. There's a whole lot of different dynamics at play there. What is that relationship like when you're working in the practice, as you're starting to purchase into it? Then when you take over, I mean, what is that relationship like? What are the dynamics at play there when you're working, especially with your father?
If you knew my dad, he's one of the best humans that you'll meet. I mean, he really is. He's always trying to be helpful. He's trying to figure out new ways of doing things, and so it's easy. I mean, it was easy. That he helped. He brought me in and said, let's. When he wasn't just giving lip service. If he says, Chris, what do you want to do? Let's do this. And then I would have this idea of, okay, let's try this new thing. Let's do this new technology. Let's integrate this new protocol into the practice. And I would be the one sitting there like, I don't know, can we really make this work? And he'd be like, you think we can make this work? I'm like, yeah, I think we can. All right, let's do it. And then he's like, he's not doing it, but he's like purchasing the things that needed to be purchased in order to say, like, removing all the barriers, all the reasons that I might not want to do it. He just was like, yeah, I believe in you. Let's do that. So, I would say that's easy. Probably the hardest part, Evon, that was most challenged for us is, and I still think it's a difficult time, is when we get together, it's still business. That's probably the hardest part where, if we go and work out together, go on a run or go on a golf trip, inevitably it comes back to like, well, how can we take care of our patients better? Or what's this new thing on the horizon? And that's probably the most difficult thing. I mean, if there is a difficult thing, but that's it. We wind up, I've had my wife tell us before, like, can we not, she's a 50-50 owner with me of this business, right? We were married for 18 years. I can't do something that she's not going to like doing. I wouldn't do that. But she said, can we not have, like, when we go to dinner with your parents tonight, can we not talk about business? Like, sure. Yeah, I suppose we can try.
Yeah. So instead of having like a clear line where business stays in the business and family is with family, like you're seeing it blend a whole lot whenever you're together, especially with your dad. Yeah.
Yeah. That's probably the toughest dynamic.
Has that changed with your wife now? I mean, running it with your wife, do certain things stay in the office versus come home? And what is that dynamic like?
Yeah, I think most of the time I try to keep that as separate as I can. Like, if we're going, unless there's something that's really pressing that I need to discuss, then I don't bring that, and I try to keep it, not keep it hidden, but I just, I don't want to bring all that stuff to the table. And so when we're sitting down for dinner, we kind of all go around, all my kids, and they'll tell, they'll say what their favorite thing of the day was. And I try to reflect on what my favorite thing of the day is as well. And I try not to get into, man, this we have this issue or this thing. And unless it's really pertinent, I do try to make an effort. So that's not all we're talking about, but I don't do as great a job as I should.
Yeah, I can imagine. I had a conversation on this podcast with Dr. Bethany Fishbane, and she was talking about her experience in co-owning a practice with her husband. And one of the interesting things she talked about was that when they're home, she sort of had to figure out, like, mid-conversation, like, was this a business leadership conversation or was this just a spouse venting to his or her spouse? Like that, like, do I need to follow up on what my husband's telling me, or does he just need to, have a drink at home and vent? Like, it's an interesting dynamic when you have, business that you can either try to leave away from the house or always is really getting into the household and blends into all your everything else going on in your life.
It's the problem of like trying to solve problems, right? Like, part of being a business owner, as you know, is is you're always trying to evolve and do something better, right? It's not necessarily solving a problem, but can I enhance this little thing I'm doing in a way that makes the patient experience better or helps us detect this thing better? You're constantly thinking about that. And so when my wife has something that she's thinking of, my question often, I have to step back and actually say, do you want me to solve the problem or do you want me to listen? And I don't necessarily have to say that. I have to think that. I have to think, does she want me to just listen to what she's saying now, or does she want me to be the problem solver?
Yeah.
And so anyway, I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Interesting. And, let's talk to, I guess, another practice owner who is thinking about their own succession. And maybe that is an internal succession, like you saw yourself. I mean, they're hearing your story. There's a lot of really intentional business planning going into that. Your dad knew that. It seemed like you were both aware that you were going to come in and there was going to be this internal succession, and business decisions sort of followed that intentionality. What would you say to a practice owner that is thinking about, what is my succession plan for this practice? And maybe it's an internal succession plan. How do they look for who that associate is going to be, or who that other doctor is going to be? How do they find that person? What do they want to see in that individual that tells them, okay, this might be that right person to step in and start to take over as I want to exit?
I'll tell you what I think about when I think about who's the right person. I want to see them taking initiatives. I want to see them, being able to take something that is, maybe we got to do this, right? Can you first, can you be a workhorse, right? I want to see, can you grind it out? So as an example, I've got an associate that has just really delved into myopia management. We've done myopia management for years. She's been since I was basically just out of school, and intentionally doing myopia management since about 2012. She's been with us for 5 years, and she's really taken that and run with it. She's doing things that I wouldn't do. She's taking many more cases, and she's sort of branched out and done some of those things. I have another associate who's brand new, literally just graduated in May, and the types of things that I see from her that make me think, yeah. So on the one hand, right, the example I just gave you is like a clinical practice where it's like, I'm going to take this and I'm going to own it. Like my first associate, that's what she has done. And then now we have my new associate where it's kind of like, hey, we need to do this new process. And I found that she's taken it and figured out the process, and she's like reporting it, guiding it. And I'm not having to be the one that's kind of checking on it. Hey, how are we in this realm, or how is this coming? It's like, she's coming to me with those kind of, this is what we're doing, this is what we need to change, this is how we need to fix it. And so she's taking ownership in that. Or, even little things like, I've got we always wear headsets in the office, so we communicate with little headsets. And so we know exactly what we need. And if a patient gets added on at different times of the day, so an emergency patient comes in and we'll hear over the headset, Dr. The new doctor, her name is Dr. Blumenstock. Dr. Blumenstock, I just added a patient at 4:15. Well, our last patient generally is that okay? Can so-and-so come in at 4:15? They had this thing come up, and I'm quiet. I'm intentionally quiet. If they're listening, then they'll know. But I'm intentionally quiet on the headset, and I'm just waiting. I'm listening. What does she say? Right? Is she ready to go home at 4:15? Or is she saying, yes, I will take care of this patient, right? And then she comes over the headset and says, that's great. I'll be here to take care of them, right? It's those little things that tell me, like, these are the types of people that I want to be thinking about, that are invested primarily in patient care and then in the practice to deliver that patient care. Those are the kind of things I'm thinking about. That's probably more clinical based, but that's just my general thoughts about it.
Yeah. So that initiative, how do you start to have that conversation with them? Do you always want to see that they are wanting to have ownership stake in the practice? I have a feeling that they could be scared off by maybe the financial, what that means financially for them, and potentially taking on debt, or especially with student loans. How do you start to have that conversation about, hey, would you want to take a bigger part of this practice and take ownership in this practice? And what does that look like?
So far, I'll give you my experiences. So far, my experience has been just having small conversations over time. So, at the very beginning, when both of the associates came on, their goals at the time were that they would eventually be practice owners. And at this point, neither of them are, but I continually have those check-ins with them. So how are things going? What does things look like for you? And are we progressing in the way that they want to progress? At some point, it may be more important to me that we progress that way. But right now, I'm okay being a solo practice owner, right, or a practice owner all by myself. I'm okay with that. But I think the most important thing is to have continual check-ins, right? So, as we had discussed before, is their practice serving their needs? Is them practicing in my office, is it serving their needs? And I always look at it like, this is our practice. Yes, technically on paper it's mine, but the reality is if I pay them well and they have bonus structures in place to reward them for hard work, then it's theirs. I mean, that is their practice. And so we have that. I believe we have that. And as long as I'm checking in to make sure they don't want more, right, more ownership, and then it's a continual conversation, I guess is the point. It's an intentional continual conversation.
Yeah.
Not a big dramatic one.
Yeah, that makes sense. And where do you start to think about, okay, or maybe another way to ask this is, what are the different ways that you would see that transition funded? Is that dependent upon the timing of it? Is it all at once? Is it over time? And how are some different ways that a practice owner and an associate that's wanting to buy in can look at funding that transition?
I mean, again, I'll tell you how I think about it. I think, if I'm going to keep the practice in private hands, the reality is it's probably not going to be all at once. It's probably going to have to be over time, just like how I acquired the practice. Now, I could be wrong. If one of them has saved a bunch of money over time and they decide that they're going to do that. But my sense is that the practice is so large and has become so expensive that it's very challenging for any one person to buy that, which is the private equity conversation. My vision would be that it would transition slowly. I'm 41 years old and I've always talked about wanting to be able to retire by 55. I don't know if that's too much of a lofty goal. I don't think I will, but to be able to is a different story. And so I think it's going to be over time. So
let's talk about, that's a good transition point. I'm glad you brought that up. So let's talk about that buzzword, private equity. And it's a big topic right now, just due to the activity going on in the optometry space for how many years. I think the last one of the resources I saw were that a lot of it started back in 2014. I don't know if that's completely accurate or not, but it's been going on for a little while. Private equity has been buying and been involved in optometry for at least that long. I want to ask you your thoughts, because I know you've been researching into this, just seeing the content you're putting out. You're having conversations around this. In your research and in your conversations, what are your thoughts about how private equity is impacting the optometry profession right now, both now and into the future?
Yeah, I think for sure it's getting a lot of buzz. It's getting a lot of buzz. I think it's still underperforming compared to dentistry. Dentistry is way more saturated with private equity than optometry is. What I think it's doing is it is creating a situation where exiting optometrists are having a harder time judging that exit in a way that is reasonable to a new doctor coming into the practice. And I'm not blaming that exiting doctor. I'm just saying that that when the goal is I can just sort of sell and I'm going to get this big number, it shifts our perspective about what the practice is valued at. And when you really dig into those numbers, you're not getting that big number all at once. Most of the time, that big number doesn't come in one big lump. And so really the amount of money that you're getting in that big lump is essentially what is a reasonable number for somebody else to come in and buy you out over some period of time. And had you just been an owner taking distributions over that same period of time that somebody else was going to buy you, it's the same bottom line dollar. It just doesn't feel like as much because it's not that kind of come to the table huge number. So because of that, I think it's making doctors in kind of their middle to late stage practice where they're starting to get really where things have gotten very easy in their practice. They know how to manage specific diseases. They know how to have conversations with patients. They're very connected with their community. They've got a lot of patients coming in. And but then they get kind of bogged down in some of the minutia of running the business. So things like EHR and MIPS and compliance issues, they're just done with it. Their kids are getting grown. They have enough income, they're making good money. And they're just kind of done with all those, like managing that uncertainty and that, And so I think then that transitions into say, look, I'll just be done with it. That's my sense. I think, I've always been hesitant to say this, but the more I research the actual underpinnings of private equity, I think it is a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing for patients. I definitely don't think the doctors who are working in private equity right now are a bad thing for patients. But I think sucking wealth out of a business purely for the sake of sucking wealth out of it, specifically in a healthcare business, is just a bad thing for patients.
Yeah.
And ultimately what I see is over time and this is not, again, it's not to blame the individual doctors selling, and it's not to blame the doctors who are working for it, for that business. But the structure of private equity, in my opinion, is to suck wealth out of businesses. And they'll just spin it off to the next one and to the next one, to the next one. And who's left holding the bag? Ultimately, it's the patients. And then there's opportunity in that. So on the one hand, if it doesn't get too massive where one large company owns everything and then collapses, where for a long enough period of time where patients expect less from their eye doctors, unless that happens, there's this opportunity where this occurs, and then there's this opportunity for new practices, right? But those new practices are going to grow, and they're going to grow fast, especially if they use somebody like Eye Care Advisors, who I have no financial obligation to. I just really like the guys, and so I'd give them credit. But the practice grows a ton, and then they get to be 41 years old and thinking about the next transition and what's So I just don't think I ultimately just Evon, I just don't think it's a great thing for patients.
Yeah, that's Dr. Bass and Dr. Steinmetz, right? We'll put their information in the show notes. That's an interesting perspective because from something you and I have talked about before, from a seller's perspective, it's good to have a bigger market for your business. It's good to have another buyer at the table, and you have to think about your own family, your own financial needs, maybe before all the other stuff, but you do have other people, stakeholders involved in your business. You're the steward of this business, and you have a team, a staff, other doctors, other optometrists. You have your patients that you need to think about. So there's a lot that goes into it, and it is hard to see from my perspective, from outside of optometry looking in. It is hard to see how that progressing further and further and further is great for patients or doctors. I see that in financial planning. We have a lot of the same stuff, but like you said, what we also see is that there are more and more newer businesses that want to do things differently than have always been done. And a part of that, and I'm curious to know your thought of that, and a part of it in our space is specialization, or adding specialties or niches into the business. Do you see that being a part of the growth of new practices in the optometry profession? How does that play into that?
Yeah, I think it's a big deal. I think that if private equity is going to come in with efficiencies and cost savings on goods, then they're going to squeeze what they know And then they'll find other avenues to try to drive the doctor to do other things, to maybe incentivize them to do X, Y, and Z. I mean, that would be the concern over time. That would impact patient care. But ultimately, there has to be a drive within the doctor to try to want these services, and it has to be more than financial. I believe that they have to really believe they're taking care of patients, because, while there is a rogue financial advisor, a rogue optometrist, a rogue ophthalmologist, most of us just want to take care of our patients, and we want to do so in a way that makes patients happy, gives them a pleasant experience, and has good outcomes. Well, if that's not the primary driver, then patients will feel it, doctors will feel it, and they won't be effective with it. But if they see these new opportunities that will allow them to take better care of their patients, and it's purely about patient care, then they're gonna dive into those specialties. And so that's where I really see that there's all these opportunities to. I view, like, when people talk about not having too many graduates from optometry school, I mean, they're right. Too many graduates if all you're doing is churning out, glasses prescriptions for normal patients. But guess what? Most patients have other stuff going on. If you look at prevalence data, I talk about this all the time, so much that probably people don't like hearing me say it. But if you look at prevalence data, you would expect that patients have something else going on that needs to be managed and attended to. And they need to be talked to about those things, and they appreciate being talked to about those things, and educated about them, and they appreciate those things that are taken care of. And so by doing that, there's these huge opportunities to serve patients where they're not consciously aware of those things. And it's incumbent upon us as a profession to have those conversations. We have not been historically as good as dentistry at doing it, as good as the American Heart Association about talking about diabetes and cholesterol and et cetera. But we need to be better, and being better really starts in the exam room, having those conversations. But again, it's not hard to develop a specialty. Or actually, what I advocate for is specialties. I think in a primary care practice, you can serve most patients most of the time. And that's something that patients will pay for. They'll pay out of pocket for it. It makes you more resilient to downturns in markets. And so, I think specialties play a huge role.
Yeah, I love that. And what I've read, from the outside looking in, what I've read is that demand for optometry services, optometric services, should surpass supply in the future. A lot of which is based on age-related eye issues, age-related illnesses, and also from shockingly and maybe frighteningly from kids and their use of screens and electronics. And it sounds like there's so much opportunity to address those very specific issues and really stand out from the maybe cookie cutter approach of some of your larger competition. Like, does that sound like a fair outlook for the future? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think completely. I think on the one hand, it would be, if I were going to there are opportunities for niche practices in one disease state. So you'll see, like, myopia. All they do is myopia. And I think that can work, myopia management. I think you could have specialty contact lenses. That could work. So I think that's a fair statement. And I think there are lots of opportunities to incorporate those into your practice in a really legitimate way.
So I want to be respectful of your time. So as we sort of wrap up here, if there's an optometrist listening, hearing all the negative stuff about consolidation and private equity and vision plans and just all of these challenges to private practice, and they're worried about, does it make sense to get into private practice ownership or does it not? What would you say to that optometrist who maybe wants to and has a desire to own private practice, but is concerned hearing all the stuff that you might hear about, everything we talked about earlier?
I think there's a ton of blue sky. I think that it's not without its detriments. The challenges in practice are significant, but if you're willing to overcome them and take on those challenges, there is a huge opportunity. Whether you're joining a practice, you want to buy a doc out that's retiring, or you want to start your own practice, I think there are so many opportunities to really excel. It comes down to a mentality of believing that what you're doing is what's best for the patient, and that if you're committed to that process and you're committed to saying, look, as long as I'm taking care of the patient, and I'm going to find new ways to take care of the patient so that I can serve them, and not be stymied by, an insurance plan wants to cover this, but doesn't want to cover that. Or an insurance plan tells me I got to do this, but I can't do that. You can navigate that stuff. Where it is a challenge is if you let them own you. If you let them dictate the level of service you're going to provide, then it can be frustrating. You'll see people on social media, really unhappy with their decision in the profession. But if you own that doctor-patient relationship and you have command over it, and you take specific steps that will remove barriers to that care that patients need and want, then there's complete blue sky. It's not easy, but it can be systematized and it can completely be done.
Well, I love that. I have thoroughly enjoyed having you on. Thank you so much for coming on. And where can people find you, learn more about what you're doing, contact you? How do people learn about what you're doing?
Thanks, Evon. So thanks for having me on. A couple places. So you can find a podcast, iCode Media, Chris Wolfe podcast on iCode Media. So just search EYECODE Media on any of your favorite podcast apps. You can also find any of our resources on iCode Education, EYECODE education.com. And maybe you'll see me around at another one of these sometime.
Well, I really appreciate it. To the listener, really appreciate your time today, and we will catch you on the next episode. Take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mendrin is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.